A wealthy man mocked an old woman at an auction, but when he found out who she really was, he was left speechless. Jason walked over others, but in his memory, it didn't seem as grim as it might have looked from the outside. Once, during a deep crisis, fate unexpectedly gave him a chance. Back then, he was a nobody, a small clerk in a company on the verge of bankruptcy. In those years, his father had run away, leaving behind a young son, a wife, and elderly parents with no money. The future seemed bleak, and he had given up hope for a miracle. But one day, fate smiled on him, and he seized the opportunity. "What is the meaning of this?" roared the director, throwing a pile of papers into the air. "How could you miss the shortfall? This is the state reserve, everything must be measured to the kilogram, to the pound." Mr. Glory was red with anger and fear. This was the second mistake in the past month. Their company supplied the government. If the authorities turned their back on them, nothing would save them from bankruptcy. All the workers would be on the street, including the director, who might even end up behind bars. "Do you understand what you've done?" In the corner of the office sat a small man. He slowly and stealthily loosened the tie that was choking his thick neck. Tiny drops of cold sweat trickled down his wrinkled forehead. He was the shipping dispatcher. Although he wasn't directly to blame for the incident, he knew. Those were hard times for everyone. People clung to any chance to survive, and Jason was no exception. A colleague at work, one of the few trusted by the management, slipped up and made a serious mistake. Jason realized this was his chance. He cunningly framed the man, presenting his own version of events in such a way that they believed him. The management fired his colleague, and Jason was promoted. Back then, it seemed to him that he had done nothing wrong. In those times, to survive, you had to be not just cautious but calculating. "Well, Mr. Lawrence, I congratulate you on your promotion," Mr. Glory said with a blissful smile, shaking the hand of the new senior storekeeper. "You've earned this. If it weren't for you, our humble company would have withered away. There's no place here for those who can't load a truck properly, right?" Jason smiled weakly, not fully realizing what he felt. "Right. Thank you, sir." Step by step, he climbed the career ladder, and every new success was accompanied by unpleasant feelings in his soul. The first doubts came when he forced a close friend and colleague to leave the company. This was the man with whom they had shared hardships in the early days, but he had become too much of a hindrance at the new stage. At first, Jason tried to reassure himself. "It's just business, nothing personal." But deep down, he knew he had betrayed his friend for his own success. His hands didn't get dirty right away. In the early years, his manipulations seemed harmless, just a game of survival in the cruel world of business. He didn't consider himself heartless or cruel. That's just how the world around him was. "You have to sacrifice something to survive," he repeated to himself, justifying every move. The crisis raged on, and tensions rose. He had to make increasingly difficult and dubious decisions. People around him were losing their jobs, their families, and even themselves. Jason, however, not only managed to keep his position but also rose to new heights. He made connections in high places and began to understand that power wasn't just about controlling others. Now he could manipulate not only his colleagues but entire departments and even companies. In time, he had to sacrifice not only his friends but also his own humanity. He stopped paying attention to those left behind, the fired, the forgotten, the humiliated. Their fates no longer concerned him. All that mattered was his success, his survival in this ruthless world. The past grew more and more blurry, and he could no longer remember exactly when he crossed the line. These harsh life lessons had been instilled in him since childhood, learned from his father, who had never been gentle. Gordon was a stern and unyielding man, and as the years went by, Jason increasingly understood where he had inherited his skill for manipulation. His father taught him not through words, but through actions, actions that left deep scars on the son's soul. "You can't even make soup properly, you wretch," Gordon spat with disgust, throwing a spoon toward the woman. "Did you dump the whole salt shaker in? You must be trying to poison me." There were many rumors about his father's past, and each one seemed less flattering than the last. In his youth, his father had been married to another woman, but no one knew exactly how that marriage ended. All that was discussed was that Gordon had left his wife with a considerable fortune, leaving her with nothing. The story that he had been as poor as a church mouse before marrying was retold with envious tones. Many thought him a trickster who had managed to clean out his first wife, and this was how he built his new life. How he did it remained a mystery, but the result was clear. He remarried, and by then, his fortune was intact. "Last time you said the soup was undersalted." "I'm not a mind reader to know exactly how you'll like it." Zoe lowered her eyes to her plate. "I stood by the stove all day. Soup, pie, salads. You could say thank you for once in your life." The woman feared looking her husband in the eye. In this situation, it would have been wiser to stay silent. But with each passing year, it became harder and harder for Zoe to hold her tongue. It was difficult to call this a life, but it gave her son a ticket to a brighter future. Private school, sports, without Gordon, the boy would have none of that. Meanwhile, the man grabbed his mug of hot coffee. "Say another word. You should be thanking me for having something to cook with and for still having your teeth to eat it with. Forgotten who paid for your braces, huh?" In his second marriage, with Jason's mother, his father was far from a model family man. He didn't hesitate to raise his hands, and his cruelty was evident not only in words, but also in actions. He often took his anger out on the mother, and the son would silently watch from the shadows. His childhood was filled with fear and the silent understanding that power and strength ruled all. He grew up seeing his father control his mother, and at the slightest resistance, his father would lash out. Despite her bitter tears, she stayed by his side. These scenes left a deep mark on Jason's consciousness. He learned one lesson: those who hold power over others survive in this world. But the hardest blow came when hard times struck the country. The crisis, which was destroying lives and destinies, became a true test for many. Gordon, taking advantage of the chaos, suddenly disappeared. Without any warnings, without goodbyes, he simply vanished from their lives, leaving neither a trace nor an explanation. He left as he always did, without guilt or remorse, as if his past life was just an episode that could be erased from memory. He didn't even inform his own parents about his departure. No explanations, no attempt to support his family. "Jason, please, tell me you know what to do," Zoe looked pleadingly at her son. He even cleaned out the safe. "My jewelry box. He took everything. Everything." The young man stood in the middle of a half-empty room. Things were scattered around him, and the cabinet doors were wide open. His father had indeed taken everything of value from the apartment. "Well, I have a job," he began hesitantly, nervously rubbing his neck. "And we can find you a job too. We can sell the apartment, buy a smaller one, and there'll be some money left. We'll get by." "Probably." Zoe sighed heavily. Gordon had never let her work. Not even for her own pleasure, just to avoid sitting at home alone. She couldn't even imagine what it would be like to work. And most importantly, what would she do? She had an education, but who would hire her without experience, nearly a retiree? They also couldn't forget about Gordon's elderly parents, who needed care. Zoe had no idea how to cope. "Mom, everything can be worked out. We could even move in with Grandma and Grandpa. They need care anyway, and that way we'd always be nearby." Jason sat down on the couch next to his mother. "We could get you a job as a cashier. You see what's going on. Any job is necessary right now. We just have to. Just." He pressed his lips together. He himself wasn't ready for such a betrayal. It would have been one thing if his father had just left, taking his belongings, but he had left the family without a single cent. Jason was still too young to make any serious decisions. But he was the only one who could bring in at least some money. So now the responsibility rested on him. "We just can't give up, Mom." And so, the young man found himself as the head of the household, unprepared for the role. He was left alone with a bewildered mother who couldn't cope with the blow fate had dealt. He had to grow up overnight. He already knew that the world didn't forgive weakness, and that in circumstances like these, kindness couldn't be counted on. The lessons his father had taught him by example became his guiding light. He understood that life demanded hard decisions, sacrifices, even if it meant losing one's humanity. From that time on, he learned to act just like his father, coldly and without regret. Jason couldn't let his family starve or freeze to death. Every day seemed darker, and the crisis in the country was escalating. The situation worsened month by month. The heating plants stopped working, leaving homes frozen to the core. People walked around their own homes in multiple layers of clothing, hoping to protect themselves from the piercing cold, but it was only a temporary solution. "We should have bought a cottage," Zoe said wistfully, wrapping herself in the thickest blanket she could find. "We could have lit the fireplace, and it would have been warm at home." A loud cough came from the next room. Grandpa had caught a serious cold. Jason didn't even know how to comfort his mother. "This can't last forever. I'm sure we only need to hold on a little longer." Workers, desperate, began to strike. They were sabotaging equipment, putting it out of action, and stealing materials to sell just to feed their families. Government agencies were powerless. The authorities couldn't bring order to the chaos that was engulfing the country. Confusion reigned everywhere, crime was on the rise, and people were losing their last hopes for relief. Zoe, dear, bring me something hot," Grandpa called out hoarsely to his daughter-in-law. "I'm frozen through. Pour something for Grandma too." "I'm coming." Zoe perked up a little, crawled out of the blanket, and hurried toward the kitchen. Jason saw his family suffering. He couldn't just sit idly by, waiting for the crisis to end on its own. Who knew how long that would take? There wasn't enough money for food, utility bills had become unmanageable, and heating in the winter had turned into a luxury only a few could afford. Cold nights were torture, especially for his mother, whose health was deteriorating from the constant chill. It was a dreadful time for ordinary people. Every day brought new challenges, and it seemed like there was no way out. Jason knew that if he didn't act, they were headed for certain ruin. Faced with such conditions, he began to search for any means to ensure his family's survival. But in those harsh years, Jason was fortunate to have loyal friends and a natural ability to lead. This became his greatest weapon. Occasionally, he thought about the friend he had once betrayed. Jason tried not to think about how that friend was now, jobless in the midst of the crisis. If Jason hadn't done it, he wouldn't have been able to achieve such influence. Together with his friends, Jason managed to draw attention to their actions, using the chaos and people's desperation to their advantage. The population, worn out by poverty and hopelessness, began to gravitate toward his group. His gang promised money, protection, and help to those who couldn't cope on their own. They offered people not only hope but also work, albeit of a questionable nature. "Mrs. Roy, all you need to do is photograph this man." Jason slid a picture of a government official toward the anxious woman. "Make sure to capture the moment when he receives the briefcase. If you manage to photograph the license plate of the car his friend arrives in, we'll pay you a little extra." "But how will I do it? What if I get caught?" "Believe me, Mrs. Roy, no one will pay attention to a sweet old lady with a camera. It's a park. People love taking pictures of nature." This was the foundation of all his work, accessible to anyone who had been frightened and drained by the crisis. Mostly, these were tasks like giving false testimony in court, spying on politicians, and gathering compromising material. The man provided protection to those in need, helping some avoid prison while reducing sentences for others. They used the justice system, corroded by corruption, to their advantage, and it brought significant profits. But his attitude towards politicians was quite different. He could not forgive them the luxury with which they enjoyed life while the common people froze and starved. In Jason's eyes, they were the ones responsible for the ruin. At a time when most people lived in horrible conditions, politicians and bigwigs lived as if on the edge of Eden, sheltered from all the troubles that had befallen the country. Their wealth and indifference filled him with intense hatred. Thus, he gradually earned the nickname Evil Robin Hood. He didn't steal from the rich to give to the poor, but he used their own sins against them, manipulating the system for the benefit of himself and his gang. He provided help to those who followed his rules and punished those who lived off others. You know, Mr. Mitchell, you had every chance to help your people, Jason spoke slowly, pacing in front of the cornered official. But you decided that a new car was more important to you. How could I have helped them? Go on, tell me. You could have invested that money in a project instead of cutting city service workers. Jay raised an eyebrow. Was it so hard? Hard to save the city from the garbage crisis? Oh, I get it. It's much easier to squeeze money out of sick people. It seems Mr. Lloyd helped you with that? The official froze. His eyes threatened to pop out of their sockets as he realized the man standing before him knew more than he should. Who are you to threaten me? Jason smiled softly. He tossed his half-smoked cigarette to the asphalt, crushed it under his foot, then adjusted his tie and bowed, spreading his arms. Robin Hood, in the flesh, sir. He never liked officials. He never liked people who reminded him of his father. The crisis was behind him, and now he himself found a seat in the official's chair. Jason didn't try to justify himself, didn't consider himself good or bad. He had his own understanding of what conscience meant. Yes, he took bribes. Yes, he sometimes stole, but he never allowed things to descend into utter chaos. After all, he was a man of the people and knew how the ordinary worker lived. For him, it was important to stay on the edge, to do what was necessary for his well-being, but not to abuse power too harshly. Now, he had a beautiful life, a beautiful wife, and 2 children. The girls were smart, little stars in their lives, bringing joy with their successes and fun moments. There was always enough money, even more than enough. Jason no longer worried about how to make ends meet, like in the old days. His old friends no longer troubled him. Some had also found ways to arrange their lives, just like Jason. Others had ended up in jail for their sins during their peacekeeping activities. Everyone had scattered to their corners, and the days when they fought together to survive in a cruel world remained only in memories. Life flowed calmly and steadily. He took care of business, made decisions, built his career. The turbulent times had given way to stability. He had wealth, family, and peace. Those who once stood by his side were almost no longer part of his life. It was as if he had left his past behind and stepped into a new life, full of silence and certainty. Jason, aren't you going to work? Asked Lily, his wife, peeking into his office. No, I'm staying home today. He looked at the clock and smiled. I decided to take a little break. You've been working so much lately. She came closer and sat on the edge of the desk. I can't even remember the last time you let yourself relax. Maybe because I haven't done it in a long time, Jason sighed. But now everything is different. There's no need to scramble, to grab at everything. The time when I could lose everything is long gone. You've never told me about that time. Lily frowned slightly. What was really going on? Nothing good. He paused for a moment, gazing out the window. Back then, the guys and I were completely different people. We were involved in things that are best left unmentioned. Now it seems distant, like it all happened in another life. But it all led you to where you are now, right? She touched his hand softly. Yeah, I suppose, Jason smiled faintly. But back then, it felt like we were just surviving, fighting for a place in the sun. And now I have you, our girls, stability. That's enough for me. And you don't regret anything? Lily looked him straight in the eyes. Jason thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes, he admitted, but only that I didn't walk away from it sooner. The rest, it's just part of the journey. But, Lily, now I finally understand that I'm lucky. I have everything one could dream of. She leaned in and kissed him on the cheek. I'm glad you're happy now. And we'll always be by your side. I know, Jason hugged her. And that's the most important thing. Jason worked steadily, enjoyed his measured life, and spent time with his family. His life was comfortable, and he made sure to relax. Everything was in its place. Like many in his circle, he understood that the rich had their eccentricities, and part of those eccentricities played out at auctions, where people loved to compete, flaunting their wealth. There, they collected things, often useless but rare and beautiful. However, sometimes something more practical could be found, like cars or furniture. At one of those auctions, which he and his wife occasionally attended for fun, an unexpected item was up for bid, a 19th century cedar sideboard. What made it unusual was a Pegasus carved right in the center from a solid block of wood. It was a skillful and detailed image that drew the attention of everyone present. The sideboard immediately stood out among the other lots. "Darling, look at this beauty." His wife unexpectedly decided that the sideboard would fit perfectly in their interior. The man glanced at the piece for a second, doubting, but knowing his wife and her love for beautiful yet often useless things, he simply nodded with a slight smirk. Her fascination with such items was familiar to him. She always gravitated toward rarities, like a magpie that couldn't resist something shiny. Without asking too many questions, he allowed her to place a bid, knowing that a happy wife always made life easier. As he walked into the hall with the other auction participants, the man suddenly felt someone bump his shoulder. Turning his head, he saw an elderly woman. Despite her age, she looked well-groomed, but it was clear her health wasn't what it used to be. This became evident a moment later when she suddenly struck his leg with her cane. The pain was sharp and unexpected, causing the man to grimace and sharply call out to the stranger. "Hey! Watch where you're going," he snapped, still feeling the sting. The old woman seemed not to notice what had happened. Her attention was entirely absorbed by something else, and she didn't even glance at the man or offer any apology. But the official wasn't about to let this incident slide. With a sarcastic smile, he approached the woman and spoke loudly enough for those around to hear. "You know, madam, you should be visiting the doctor more often instead of attending auctions. No need to embarrass respectable people with your ailments. And if you can't afford to fix your health or relax in a good sanatorium, maybe you don't belong at the auction at all." His words were sharp and full of contempt. He expected the old lady to be embarrassed or at least react to his insults, but she only smiled faintly and looked at him with the indulgence that only elderly people who no longer need anyone's favors possess. She didn't say a word. Instead, calmly adjusting the heavy pearl necklace on her neck, she slowly continued her way into the hall. People around watched the scene with interest, and some stifled giggles as they noticed how the official stood there as if he'd received an invisible slap. "Let's go, dear. She's just an old woman. What can you expect from her?" The auction was gaining momentum, and the atmosphere in the hall grew tense with each new lot. A carved sideboard featuring a depiction of a Pegasus, which had caught the attention of many, became the star of the auction. Among the participants eagerly raising their bids was the same elderly woman. Each time someone tried to outbid her, she raised her hand without hesitation, making it clear she was determined to leave with the sideboard at any cost. The man could feel the growing tension in the room, but he remained calm. However, his wife, sitting next to him, was burning with desire to acquire the sideboard. She begged her husband to participate, whispering that it was the only chance to adorn their home with such a masterpiece. Her eyes shone with determination, and her voice trembled with barely contained emotion. With each passing minute, the bid rose, and at one point, the elderly woman named a sum that sounded like thunder on a clear day. It was simply astronomical. The room buzzed with whispers of surprise and respect for her persistence. The man glanced at Lily, hoping she would understand that this had gone too far. A piece of old wood, no matter how beautiful, wasn't worth that much money. Unwilling to engage in this senseless war over an antique, he gave up. After all, there were plenty of other things to purchase without overpaying such indecent amounts. "Sorry, darling," he said with slight regret, "but that sideboard just isn't worth it." "I understand, sweetheart," she agreed sadly, casting wistful glances at the sideboard that had so captured her heart. Meanwhile, the man in the bow tie was full of energy. The auctioneer took the card in hand. "And this wonderful antique goes to Mrs. Anna Arvin Lawrence." The old lady smiled charmingly as the auctioneer announced her name as the winner. The man was struck as if by lightning. He looked at her face again, trying to confirm his suspicions. The name called from the stage was too familiar. She could very well have been his father's first wife, the one he had only heard about. But he had always been told she left the country and that if she ever returned, she would surely be imprisoned. And yet, here she was, sitting among politicians, businessmen, and high-ranking officials, with no one intending to arrest her. It looked as if she had never disappeared at all. His wife, not understanding why her husband was frozen, shook his shoulder, trying to bring him back to reality. But he no longer listened to her. The man quickly stood up and followed the elderly woman, who had already left the hall. Despite her age, limp, and cane, she moved with remarkable confidence and agility. The man walked after her, almost running, trying to catch up, and finally, they found themselves in the parking lot. He touched her shoulder to stop her, but immediately felt a strong blow. One of the old lady's bodyguards had pushed him away, clearly unwilling to let anyone bother her. However, the woman calmly raised her hand, signaling the guard to step back. The man, gathering his thoughts, asked the only question spinning in his mind. "Were you married to my father?" "My father, Gordon Lawrence, was he your husband?" The old woman chuckled softly, her laugh both indulgent and slightly bitter. She looked at him, holding his gaze for a few seconds before replying. "Your father was a shameless scoundrel, J.J., she said, as she began to carefully get into the car. The man, trying to process what he had just heard, noticed something unusual flash under the hem of her dress, a prosthetic in place of her right leg. This unexpected discovery left him in shock, and he stood frozen, watching as the car with the woman slowly drove away. "Anna, wait," he called out to the empty space. A few days had passed since that strange encounter at the auction, but the man could not find peace. His thoughts swirled around the image of that elderly woman, whom his father had once labeled a criminal. Something was off, something that wouldn't let him rest. How could it be that this woman, who according to his father should have been arrested, now freely attended social events and was surrounded by respected people? And that prosthetic. Every time he recalled it, his heart skipped a beat. Thoughts of his late father's character, his cruelty, and the dark sides he had never bothered to hide came rushing back. These thoughts terrified him, forcing him to consider the terrible things his father might have done. The man was determined. He knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he uncovered the truth. The old lady he met at the auction wasn't just a stranger, she had once been his father's wife. She wasn't completely foreign, and perhaps she could reveal the truth about the times when the name Lawrence was surrounded by scandalous rumors. "Even now, people call me a tyrant," Jason whispered darkly, holding a family photo in his hands. "They believe that only a monster can give birth to another monster." Lily hugged her husband from behind. "But you're not a monster, are you?" "I don't decorate my wife with bruises," he muttered, "but that doesn't make me a saint. I need to find Anna. I need to know why people hated old Gordon so much." The time when his mother became pregnant coincided with the period when his father was married to this woman. Jason realized that, in a way, she could even be called his stepmother. And this only intensified his desire to find her. He wanted to talk to her, to learn what happened in the past, why she disappeared from his father's life, and what really connected her to his family. The man felt a growing sense of unease. His internal radar, the intuition that had never failed him in dangerous situations, kicked in once again. It always activated during the most critical moments of his life, as if warning him to stay alert because something wasn't right. And now, as he stood on the verge of solving this strange mystery, his gut feeling resurfaced with full force. He had used all his connections and resources to find any information about the mysterious old lady. It proved difficult. She had seemingly vanished into the city, appearing recently and leaving no significant trace. However, after several days of persistent searching, he finally got an important lead: the address of a house rented for a month. This explained a lot. She wasn't a permanent resident, which was why he hadn't encountered her before. Her presence must have been tied to some business, or perhaps something more serious. The man didn't hesitate. As soon as he got the address, he made a decision. He needed to meet her in person and uncover the truth. The next morning, barely waiting for daylight, he got into his car. His stomach churned unpleasantly. Jason knew this feeling all too well. It wasn't just nerves, it was a warning, a vague but powerful sense of impending trouble. Something's wrong, Jason muttered to himself, definitely wrong. He drove along narrow roads, almost deserted at this time of day. The familiar landscape around him now seemed alien, as if the world had paused in anticipation. The closer he got to the given address, the stronger the feeling grew that something more than just a meeting with an old woman awaited him. Oh, no. No, switch lanes, buddy, he whispered a prayer under his breath, glancing in the mirror. You don't want to be here. At an intersection, a black car caught up with him. The windows were so heavily tinted that seeing the driver or passengers was impossible, and this instantly made him anxious. The knot in his stomach tightened, as if his intuition had reached its peak. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead, and his hands began to tremble uncontrollably, gripping the wheel harder than necessary. Something about that car felt ominous, and he could no longer ignore the feeling. When the traffic light turned from yellow to red, the official instinctively tensed up. Time seemed to slow down. Just a few seconds remained before the green light, and a thought flashed in his mind: run. He couldn't withstand the internal pressure any longer and dove down to the passenger seat as if shielding himself from an invisible threat. He moved just in time, a split second before the thing he had subconsciously feared happened. A terrifying crash echoed, and his car was showered with shards of glass. Chaos reigned around him, and the sound of gunfire filled his ears. Everything happened so quickly that his mind couldn't fully grasp the situation, but his body reacted on its own. Jason felt fear paralyze him, but his survival instinct commanded him to stay put, not to move, not to show himself. Oh, God! Somebody call the police, he heard shouts from the street. The gunfire mingled with the roar of an engine that seemed to tear through the air with its ferocity. Then, the screeching of tires as the attacker's car sped away from the scene. The ringing in his ears persisted, and the echoes of gunshots buzzed in his head, but everything grew silent. The official remained still, pressed tightly against the passenger seat. He was too afraid to even breathe. The world around him slowly started to come back into focus, and only now did he realize that people had begun to gather. Concerned passers-by, who had witnessed the attack, were already calling the police and an ambulance. Shouts and questions blended into a single hum, penetrating his state of shock. "Sir, are you hurt?" A random man, pulling Jason from the car, shook him by the shoulders. "Are you hurt? Are you okay?" He still feared moving, his body frozen in fear. Still dazed, he checked himself, just a few cuts from the glass shards, but otherwise, he was unharmed. However, when he looked at his car, the horror returned. It was riddled with bullet holes. The windows were shattered, and the body was peppered with holes. Just a few centimeters lower, and one of those bullets could have killed him. If not for his intuition, if not for that sudden impulse to dive down, he would have been dead. Yeah, someone must really have it out for you. The police arrived within minutes of the attack. Flashing lights quickly surrounded the scene, and before Jason could fully process what had happened, he was already surrounded by officers. His body still shook from shock, but he knew he had to cooperate. "Sir, you need to come with us." Without hesitation, he agreed to go to the station to give a statement. While the police took care of everything at the scene, he sat in the back seat of their car. Once inside, his mind was flooded with anxious thoughts again. This couldn't be just a coincidence. Throughout the entire ride to the station, one thought haunted him: the attack happened on the very day he learned everything about the woman who seemed to have disappeared from the city. The motive was clear, and he knew who stood to gain from his elimination. Revenge. That was the word swirling in his mind. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling, and dialed a number, his father's ex-wife. She wasn't just a dark figure from the past, she was a living reminder of a family drama. His father's divorce from her had been painful, and the reason had been his mother's pregnancy. It had destroyed their marriage, destroyed everything. He waited for the line to ring, but with each passing ring, no answer came. She didn't pick up. As he headed to the police station, his suspicions only grew stronger. But the real shock awaited him ahead. When he was led into the room to give his statement, he froze in the doorway. Sitting gracefully at the table, as if completely unbothered by what had happened, was the old woman. She was calmly sipping coffee, as if attending a meeting with old friends, not sitting in a police station. "What? Why? Anna?" Jason stammered, unable to say anything better. Her face remained serene, but there was something in her eyes that made him instantly still. Jason opened his mouth, ready to ask the many questions swirling in his head, but she didn't give him the chance. She interrupted him, softly but firmly. "I know about the attack." Her voice was quiet but commanding. "But I assure you, it wasn't planned by me." Her words hung in the air, and Jason felt his heart pound harder. How did she know? And why was she here, at the station, so calmly beside him? "Your father," she continued, setting down the cup, "recently passed away. But as you understand, it's not that simple. The matter of his inheritance is far more complicated than you realize. The wrongdoers were counting on the fact that the ex-wife, whose contact information the father had never hidden, would never meet the heir. It all seemed like a carefully planned operation. Gordon had been living abroad for a long time, in the very country where he had forced his first wife to flee in order to get rid of her and her influence. These thoughts weighed heavily on the man's mind as he listened to the old woman, who gracefully sipped her coffee while telling the story with cold calmness. At that moment, she began, "They thought I would never be able to meet him again or interfere in his affairs. Gordon was sure he had severed all ties between me and my former circle." Her voice was even, but beneath the calm, there was hidden pain. The official couldn't take it anymore. Inside, everything was boiling from the information that had already overturned his understanding of his father. He interrupted her, leaning forward. "But why did you have to flee? Tell me how it happened." The old woman slowly placed the cup on the table and looked him straight in the eyes. A shadow of a bitter smile flickered across her face. She sighed and continued her story, as if diving into memories. "I literally picked him up off the street. My dear father owned a jewelry business at the time. Everything I had, I received from him." Her eyes dropped for a moment, and her voice grew a little quieter. "And your father, he owned nothing. No money, no property. He only had charisma and the ability to speak beautifully. That's how he won me over." She paused for a moment, as if checking how attentively she was being listened to, then continued. "I was young and, of course, captivated. He knew how to convince, and I agreed to marry him. It was a beautiful beginning, but as soon as he gained access to my father's business, everything began to fall apart. He started acting strangely, disappearing often, coming home late, and always looking as if he was hiding something." The memories seemed to weigh on her, but she continued, as if she needed to finally release this truth. "Then I learned the truth. One day I caught him cheating. It was Zoe, your mother. It was painful, but even more painful was how he reacted. Instead of apologizing, he raised his hand against me. That was the moment I knew I had to escape. But leaving wasn't so easy." She glanced at the empty cup, as if trying to gather her thoughts, and then continued. "The divorce was loud and messy. He didn't want to lose everything he had gotten from me and my family. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to take as much as he could. He tried to twist my arm at every step. And then he stole the documents that gave him rights to part of my father's business." Bitterness became more evident in her voice, but the old woman remained dignified. Meanwhile, his mistress announced that she was carrying his child. That fact hit him hard. Realizing that he had to act quickly, Gordon rushed the divorce, putting all his efforts into it. He couldn't afford to wait. Every minute of delay meant a risk that his plans would collapse. But in this matter, not everything depended on him. Anna's father was an influential man. He wasn't going to easily let go of the man who had ruined his daughter's life. He clung to our money. A leech. A parasite. No other way to describe him. The divorce turned out to be tough and long. Gordon used all his resources and connections, but it all ended not in his favor. Anna's father intervened, and the court ruled, leaving most of the assets with the woman. The man lost access to the business, the money, and his plans fell apart. It seemed like the end of the story, but in fact, it was just beginning. Unable to bear the defeat, he decided to take revenge in another way. He hatched a daring plan to kidnap his own wife. One morning, she simply disappeared. Fear and anxiety gripped her family. But a few days later, the ex-husband contacted her father and demanded a ransom. He wanted to get back everything he had lost and extorted a huge sum of money. The family was shocked, but the father had no choice. Anna had to return home, and for the sake of her safety, he agreed to the kidnapper's demands. But the woman who returned home was not the same one he knew. She was exhausted both mentally and physically. Her body had endured unbearable suffering. Her leg was so badly damaged that the bone could no longer be repaired. The doctors did everything they could, but the leg had to be amputated. From that moment on, she was doomed to a life with a prosthetic. It seemed like this would be the final blow from her ex-husband. But no. The ransom he received wasn't used only for his needs. He used the money to buy power, bribes to police officers, and the services of thugs who helped him continue his dirty work. Staying in the country became life-threatening. Anna knew that her life was now in danger. Every step could be her last, and she could no longer trust anyone. The only way out was to flee. And she ran, leaving behind a shattered past and pain. She hoped that no one would find her abroad, that she could finally live without fear. But the world turned out to be not so simple. Time passed, and she thought the monster would no longer be able to harm her. However, she learned the terrible news. During a crisis, her ex-husband had managed to cross the line and upset people who couldn't be easily intimidated or deceived. But then Gordon and I met again, Anna enunciated before taking a sip of her now cold coffee, and the game continued. The cruel irony of fate brought them together again in the same country. What she had avoided for years suddenly resurfaced, like a dark shadow of the past. The woman, now a successful business owner, was not as naive as she had been in her youth. Anna knew that her ex-husband wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. He was cunning and sly, just as before, which made catching him nearly impossible. They engaged in a silent, hidden struggle, neither showing their intentions on the surface, but both acting from the shadows. Every step the woman took was carefully calculated, every deal, every action. It was all part of a long war with the man she had once loved. She thought that he was only targeting her. That his revenge, his malice, was directed solely at her, and that this game was only between the two of them. But as it turned out, he was in a desperate situation, cornered. Gordon wasn't just trying to ruin her life, he was fighting for his own survival in this battle. If she had only known then how much he was suffering from his own mistakes and debts, how deeply he was trapped in problems, she might have made even more effort to destroy him. She wouldn't have given him a chance. Years of struggle dragged on, and every new day brought tension and anxiety. All this time, Anna couldn't return home, fearing for her life and the future of her business. She knew perfectly well that her enemy would stop at nothing. But then everything changed. Gordon died quickly. A blood clot came loose. His departure was sudden, and with him disappeared the threat that had hung over her head for years. "So, you came because of the inheritance?" Jason asked, still in genuine shock from what he had heard. "Do you want to take what's rightfully yours for all the suffering he put you through?" The woman shook her head. The gesture made the man's eyebrows rise even higher. But he didn't rush with questions. Jason caught the pace of the old woman's story. "Tell me, JJ, If a scrawny rooster mates with another hen's chicks, who's to blame? Anna smiled meaningfully. Gordon loved causing people pain. But you're not him, are you? I'm sorry that Zoe didn't live to see this moment. Maybe in her old age, she would have enjoyed the inheritance. But now it all belongs to you. Jason suddenly started. A few details weren't adding up in his head. Why wasn't he the sole heir? Wait, you're the ex-wife. You have no right to the inheritance. How did this happen? Anna smirked crookedly. Her hand slowly reached into her purse, from which she pulled out an already opened letter. She took out the paper from the envelope, unfolded it, and handed it to her stepson. Choke on it, old hag, the man quietly read aloud, then nervously chuckled. Seriously? He left you part of his estate but didn't write a single word about us and Mom? There were rumors that Gordon had completely forgotten he had a son. You know, JJ, by the time he reached his final day, his mind was completely clouded. I was always in plain sight, so even the most senile of men would remember me. The old woman waved her hand smoothly. He tried to insult me one last time. Ha! I buried him. That's my inheritance, my reward, and trophy. And you, JJ, you're still owed something. And that's why I'm here. It was precisely this that kept her from complete oblivion. Her thirst for justice, not for herself, but for the child who deserved what was rightfully his. It was because of this that they tried to eliminate him. His father's accomplices, who had stayed in the shadows for many years, decided to act when they felt threatened. They couldn't afford for the heir, who had no idea what dangerous circles his father had moved in, to suddenly start digging into the very corners where they had hidden their dirty dealings. The heir was an easy target. He lived an ordinary life, unaware of the conspiracy. This made him vulnerable. They didn't even try to get close to old Anna. She was too serious a target, a woman who had spent her whole life knowing how to fight back. Any attempt to touch her would not just fail, but would result in complete disaster for the attackers. But Jason Lawrence, a man who hadn't even begun to understand what was going on, was an easy prey. He didn't know about his father's dark deeds, and that made him the perfect target. So, little J, one assassination attempt won't be enough. You're going to have to work a little harder. The old woman's words hit the man like a lightning bolt. He jumped up from his chair, nearly knocking it over. Panic instantly gripped his mind. If the bandits were trying to get rid of him, then his girls, his wife and little daughters, might also be in mortal danger. The thought hit him so hard that it took his breath away. He imagined the worst-case scenario, and his heart froze in terror. They're in danger. His voice was filled with despair. My family. But before he could finish his thought, the woman silently raised her hand, gesturing for him to stop. Her face remained calm, as if she had already anticipated his reaction. The man froze, trying to understand what she meant. Your family is already safe, she said calmly, her voice filled with certainty. I took care of it. They were moved to a secure place before you were even told. Everything will be fine now. These words seemed to instantly lift the weight off his shoulders, though his heart still pounded in his chest. He tried to process what she had said, but everything was happening too unexpectedly. His girls were safe. But how? And why had she taken care of them before he even realized the danger? The woman looked at him with understanding. She knew full well that to him, family meant everything, and that's why her first step had been to protect them. Anna often kept an eye on Gordon's son. Out of pure curiosity. Just to see how another abandoned, betrayed soul lived. And she liked the person Jason was becoming. Hurry up, son. It's time to rid yourself of this poison, Anna coughed into her hand, her voice trembling at the end of the sentence. The elderly woman had gathered all her willpower when she decided to reveal everything she knew about her former husband's schemes. Every sentence was like a thorn in her heart, but she understood that it was the only way to put an end to this long story. She handed the man the names of all the accomplices, their hidden schemes, encrypted contracts, and shadowy connections that had ruined lives and fates. Oh my God, Jason whispered in quiet horror as he looked at the makeshift dossiers on the criminals. I worked with half of these people. So you know what to do with them. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Jason didn't hesitate. He knew he couldn't handle this alone. So he gathered his old friends, those who had supported him in difficult times, those who knew what loyalty meant. These people were ready to help, understanding that not only his life was at stake, but also the safety of his family. Using his connections, he coordinated efforts with the police, who also began actively pursuing the accomplices. Soon, the tracks of the criminal group started surfacing. One by one, they were found in the most unexpected places in the city. The first two were caught by the police after a brief chase, and despite their stubbornness, they couldn't keep silent. The dirty interrogation methods, while perhaps not legal, were understood by everyone at that moment as a necessary means to an end. These two soon revealed the names of the remaining participants, those who had remained in the shadows and seemed untouchable by justice. The operation unfolded quickly and efficiently. The official and his team acted in sync, each new step bringing them closer to the end of this dark chapter. When the trial was finally over, the atmosphere in the courtroom was filled with tension that slowly dissipated as people began to leave. The elderly woman remained standing, watching it all come to a close. She, like many others, understood that this was not just a trial of criminals, it was a battle for justice, for her own right to a peaceful life. Guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security colony, the judge's voice still echoed off the walls. Anna stood alone, surrounded by the silence of the empty courtroom, and for the first time in many years, she felt it was easier to breathe. The fear that had haunted her for so long was slowly fading away. She was no longer shackled by the memories of the man who had ruined her life. Now, finally, it was over. The freedom she had waited so long for had become real. "Goodbye, Gordon," she whispered into the emptiness, "now, forever." A tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek, not from grief, but from relief. It was all behind her. She had done what she had to do, acted according to her conscience, and that gave her satisfaction. She knew her actions had protected those she loved, and now they were truly safe. A man slowly approached her. His steps were almost inaudible on the empty courtroom floor, but she knew he was there. When he gently embraced her, the woman froze for a moment, as if not expecting the gesture, but then relaxed in his arms. Her heart, which had lived in fear and struggled for so long, finally began to calm. Jason held her softly with gratitude and tenderness, understanding that if it weren't for her thirst for justice, her willingness to see things through to the end, his life and the lives of his children might already have been destroyed. In his mind, he saw the horrors that could have occurred if Anna hadn't intervened. He might already be lying in the ground, and his girls could have become targets in this cruel game. One person's selflessness had saved an entire family, and this wasn't just a duty, it was her personal path to freedom from the past. Anna had endured so much pain and suffering, and her heart had long been hardened by the anguish she had tried to escape. Ironically, it was now the child of the very mistress who had caused her so much loss, her former life, her health, her faith in people, who was helping her restore justice. "Anna, I think it's time for us to go." Jason's voice was quiet and gentle. "The girls are waiting for us." But he wasn't like his father. In his hands, she didn't feel the cruelty that had accompanied her former husband. There was something different about him, something genuine. He knew how to love, and that ability was in every one of his actions, in every glance. He appreciated everything that had been done for him, and he especially valued the fact that this woman, who should have hated him, chose to help him. "We've reserved a table at the restaurant. Well, family and friends. We wanted to celebrate the occasion." The man gently moved the old woman a little to look her in the eyes. "It won't be a real celebration without you. Your presence is a must. Why are you so attached to an old one-legged woman?" "You know, JJ, I'm flying back home soon." The woman awkwardly averted her eyes from her stepson. "But isn't your home in this city?" Jason asked with a boyish smile. "Cancel your tickets, Anna, stay with us. We've spent almost a year side by side, risking our lives together. How can we let you go to some foreign country? And look at my girls, they've gotten so used to you." The old woman suddenly froze. She had almost forgotten what a homeland was. After all, she had grown up in these parts. In this city. Her parents had lived and passed away here, and she hadn't even been able to attend their funerals. Her nephews lived here too, the children of her younger brother, whom she hadn't spoken to in decades. She had been afraid something might happen to him. There were things for her to do in this little town. "All right, boy. I think something good might come out of this." Maybe after so many years of running and living in fear, it was indeed time for her to stop. She had earned peace, especially in her old age, when her strength was fading and her heart longed for quiet. Maybe this was the very place where she could finally find happiness. She silently extended her hand to Jason, and together they stepped out of the courthouse, where everyone, from friends to assistants, was waiting for them on the steps. Firecrackers went off, joyful cheers echoed around, and the old woman was immediately embraced by two lively little girls. Anna couldn't hold back her tears. She was home.